Welcome back to an episode of our month-long Women in STEM series in honor of Women's History Month. I'm Milan Cacho, an geneticist and science communicator. Along with this interview series, for the entire month of March, we are raising money for Girls Who Code. Together, we can help close the gender gap in the technology fields. Please find the donation link in the show notes. Today, we talk with Ultrasaurus, a full-time content creator with her Bachelor of Science in Biology who specializes in bioethics. During our conversation, we talk about her non traditional journey into the sciences, what being a woman in STEM means to her, and a deep rabbit hole into sustainable fish farming, bioethics regarding animal welfare, economic discrimination, and the cultural considerations in regards to farming. Ultra, welcome on in. Could you give us a little bit of an introduction about who you are and what is your scientific background?
Absolutely. So, for those of you that don't know me, my name is Ultrasaurus. I'm a mixed race Canadian streamer. We do a lot of simulation, survival, and strategy games on Twitch. I am, as of November, officially a full time content creator. So, I do this for a job. And I don't know if you caught it from my name, but we love dinosaurs. The Ultrasaurus is actually a dinosaur, too, by the way. And in terms of my educational background, I have a Bachelor of Science in Biology, where I focused a lot of my schooling on animal ethics and welfare, specifically with a lot of the intensification of agriculture, so animal farms on Canada.
What made you interested originally in the sciences? Like, what was it that brought you towards the scientific question? Was it breaking things as a kid? Was it putting things back together? Was it animals? Because again, of the farming connection, what was it?
You know what? I've actually never stopped to think about that, but I think the animals were a really big thing for me. Especially, I loved the Discovery Channel as a kid. I loved learning. I loved just like soaking in information. And like, I was kind of that annoying kid, especially around adults. Like, I always had questions. I just wanted to understand the world around me a little bit better. And even I remember, I've got a wild memory. I remember specifically in kindergarten, the teacher was like showing us photos of dinosaurs, and she's like, "Do you guys know what extinct means?" And I'm like, "Yes, I do." um, but yeah, going into high school and taking more of the sciences, I grasped the information very easily, and I loved what I was learning. And we can talk about this later, but I kind of had an interesting change in gears in terms of like I focus on biology, but I've always been a STEM science person. But partway through my university schooling, I kind of rediscovered my love for biology.
So there was a bit of a love lost and then a regain later on.
Um, it wasn't even a love lost. I just had different plans, different ideas for what I wanted to do with my life and my career. And I had several kind of pivotal moments all throughout my post secondary schooling where I kind of learned more and more and more about myself and kept pivoting and changing what I was going to do.
Would you say then that like there was a heavy importance on being able to do a little career exploration, see different things and different like avenues of learning, right? Like that seems to be a lot of like hit and miss on
Oh,
whether or not you should
absolutely.
go explore versus not. Like what all were you exploring at the time of maybe this, maybe that? Like what were some of your interests?
Um, I mean, if you're interested, I can kind of just tell the story of like my, I guess, educational journey, if you're okay with that, and it kind
Please.
of overviews that too.
I might interject and
Um,
ask some questions if that's okay.
that's totally okay. A lot of people don't know this, but I didn't graduate from high school. I didn't. I had a really tough time in high school, and because of health issues, I didn't graduate. And I think it's really, really hard for kids in high school because you're basically it's drilled into you that like graduating high school and going to university or college right after, like that's the end all be all, and you got to have your life figured out. And I don't know, you kind of are put into this situation where I felt like a failure. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with my life, and people shouldn't have to feel that way because A, you don't have to go to post secondary to be successful in life. There are so many different avenues, so many different things that you can do. But B, it's just that pressure that it kind of seems like life is set in a linear fashion from high school onwards. And if you don't fit what the world expects you to do, then what are you doing? I took the year off and I basically went back and I got my high school equivalency at a smaller university. And in doing that, I remembered like, gosh, I love chemistry. Gosh, I love math. And as I was working on this stuff, I decided I don't even know how it came to be, but I think it's because I like problem solving. I was like, you know what? I'm going to become an engineer. And so I got my high school equivalency and I got accepted into the engineering program and I started working my way through university there. And I took physics. And I realized I should not be working on any bridges or
Snot
anything
Squirrel
structural,
just
and
subscribed for
this
5
is
months.
this is not the life I want to lead. I love everything about engineering but the physics part, which is arguably probably the most important part.
That's the part that I found the most terrifying as well. Just like, well, there's letters and numbers, and they're all mixed together here, and all the equations coming on in. It was just not as
Mhm.
a straightforward, like in my brain, as other properties were as well.
Yeah, and so I it was at that moment where even though everything that I'd worked towards at that point was all based towards engineering, I stopped and I was like, do I really want to do this? You're not enjoying this right now. It's not going to get any better. And I reflected on what was important to me in life and what I valued and enjoyment out of the work that I do or just even enjoyment in getting the education that I'm paying for, let's do something that we like. And I kind of looked back to my roots. What do I like? I love animals. I love biology. I just soak up that information like a sponge. And so I reached for the stars and I wanted to go into pathology. Because I love lab work. A big goal of mine has been wanting to make a difference in the world, wanting to make change, wanting to do good. And so I was like, if I work with like cancer research, I think that's a really good start. And I went from not great graduating high school to transferring to one of the top 50 universities in the world. So
Wow.
if I can do it, you can do it. Like, don't let people tell you what you can't or can't do. You can do anything you put your mind to. 100%.
What would
Um,
you say was the most difficult part of that transition, right? Like you said, like getting into one of the top colleges, right?
mhm.
Universities, like was it more the stigma of you not being able to make it from other people? Was it self-reflection? Like, what was it like, or what advice would you give to someone who's in a similar track who would like to go through these, the motions and actually jump into these kinds of university settings?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess for me, first and foremost, it's all mind over matter. If you want to do something, put your mind to it. And a lot of what I did and went through was self motivation. I wanted to go to university. I wanted that degree or that level of education. And, you have to have that level of determination to stick through and go through it. But I think what was also really hard was, like I didn't graduate high school, and all of my friends that I went to school with are already way deep into university, and um, I felt very judged. I felt it was hard for me to even make friends in university too, because everybody was a lot younger than me, and so I think focusing on myself, focusing on the end goal, focusing on bettering myself and not worrying about what other people thought, whether it be my classmates or my friends. My family's always been very supportive, so I don't have to worry about them. But yeah, no, that was definitely like I felt very proud of myself for accomplishing and achieving what I did because I knew it was there and I knew a lot of people didn't believe in me, but I believed in myself, which was, I think, really important and instrumental.
It really is, and that's something that's unfortunately drilled out of a lot of people. Like even a lot of folks in chat are saying, how much value is tied to graduating that high school versus actually branching out and being able to pursue different things. And so you being able to
Mhm.
have the support network from the family, but also that really strong self drive, like you said, made that world of a difference. So
Mhm.
what was the next step for you, Ultra?
Yeah, and so I went to this next university with the every intention of going to med school and becoming a pathologist. And end of the day, if I really wanted to have done that, I think I could have. But I really do encourage other people who are either not maybe in post secondary yet or are in post secondary right now. Just because you have a goal in mind, you're going to become A, B, C, or D. Try other courses. Look at what interests you. I took some wild courses in university. Like I took a course that like an ornithology course where we did birding. I took a course on horses. I took a course on dinosaurs and a course on insects. Is that ever going to help me become a pathologist? Absolutely not. But it made me realize that, oh, maybe I actually don't want to become a pathologist. Maybe I don't want to go to school for another 8 years. Maybe I'm happy actually doubling down and learning more about these things that actually really interest me, where I'm excited to go to class to learn more. And so that was kind of that other transitionary period of, well, I want to become a doctor and do this, but I really like this.
So it was being able to identify your passion versus just let me chase this maybe
Yeah,
laid out conventional path, right?
exactly.
And
And like,
it's really cool that you took a horse class because you're also maybe a little known fact for folks, you are a horseback rideress, right?
mhm. And I went into that course. I've not that I was like, I know everything, but I was like, what am I gonna learn? I ride horses, I'm around them all the time. Like, I know basic biology. No, I learned things. I learned things. I didn't know about gastroliths, the stones that form in a horse's intestines that they literally look like pearls because they're just like polished over time through like the movement in their guts. You learn about equine pain phase. You can gauge how much pain a horse is in by certain facial cues, and you can actually measure this. I learned a lot of really cool things, and I learned that horses are just what's the word I'm looking for? Their bodies are not built very well. They're kind of built to fail. Their intestinal tract is awful and very flawed. So, yeah, no, it's super cool, and I would like that's my one word of advice to anybody who's in post secondary is try things you're interested in. Even if you finish your degree, I know people who have gotten degrees in business, and they have that, and they actually go back to school because they're like, actually, I want to become a vet. I want to go back into biology. There's nothing wrong with that.
Which one of the classes that were almost like rabbit holes at the time, which one of them kind of drove you towards that love of the animals, then, not being a pathologist?
It actually was straight up an animal ethics and welfare course, and I took there were certain different variations of it at different levels that focused on unique and different parts of the world or the systems. And I think I took 3 or 4 of those courses, all of them with the same prof, and he's retired now. But gosh, it was such a treat being able to learn animal ethics and welfare from this professor. He made the course, but the information was also really interesting. And I will say that was a course where I went into it with my own developed opinions and thoughts, and it blew my mind. They basically taught animal ethics and welfare very much from an objective scientific standpoint. They didn't have a narrative, they didn't have any bias. They were like, here's the facts, here's the information about the systems. Do what you want with that information. But I just really love how the information was presented, and like the fact that I just kept taking more and more of these courses. Like if there were 5 or 6 of them, I would have taken all 5 or 6. And so definitely that was very much I don't think we're becoming a pathologist anymore moment.
Could you, for some of us who maybe didn't have the opportunity to take this kind of class, could you let us know just like what exactly is an animal ethics course? What is that about? What is the end goal of it, and what are you learning? Because it's one of those where it's like people say animal ethics and welfare, but it feels almost like
Hmm.
this catch-all term now. Like, what did it mean in this context?
The introductory course that I took, it basically went over several different things. It went over, um, I'm Canadian, so a lot of the farming stuff that we learned was specific to Canada, but it talked about, the different farming systems with pigs, with cows, with chickens, and, just different types of housing, the problems that you would encounter, like, parasites or lameness or, certain medical procedures. So it kind of went over a very general, broad overview of those systems. And it was very enlightening because a lot of things that you see at face value in these farms, you would go, oh, wow, that looks really bad. That's very cruel. That's awful. We should stop that. But then you learn, okay, well, the alternative is sure, this looks nicer and happier, but now they're going to get injured and the animals are all going to kill themselves. And no, it's actually wild. If you guys don't know this, chickens are very prone to cannibalizing each other. That's a problem with raising chickens. And so, um, yeah, it's not nice. um, so that was one aspect. Other aspects were focusing on conservation and like the aspects of like hunting and trophy hunting and what does that mean, and especially for they brought up like the fox hound hunts that they do, and just like the different levels of stress and the morality behind things. Places where you can pay to hunt animals in Africa, it's not black and white. It's not just good and bad. It's kind of gray area because in these areas, these locals are paid very, very well to protect this specific area of animals to continue this tourist industry. And so there's an incentive to conserve and protect these animals, whereas in other conservation areas, yes, they have protection. Yes, there are people hired there, but there's not that level of investment by not just people working there, but the village to keep these animals safe. And then we also learned a lot about looking into charities, looking into organizations and what makes a good charity, good organization, doing some deep learning and diving deep into, looking up an organization and finding all of the information to find out, well, is this a good charity? Is the money going towards the animals?
So it's not a given, right? Like that is the myth, right? That all charities are going to be
Yeah,
giving everything to the animals.
no.
Because you mentioned you were going to be doing a charity stream soon too, is that something that you
Hmm.
actively look into and see like what's a good viable
Oh,
charity?
absolutely. No, some charities, of course, they have to resonate with me too, but certain charities where face just face value, they look like they would resonate with me, and I do some research, and it's like, I think not.
So always vet your charities.
Always, always, always. Yeah. Yeah, do
So
your research.
with this course, I mean, it's really cool, like the breadth and depth that the course went into, and like being able to
Mhm.
make a lot of things accessible that maybe previously one would not normally think about because it almost feels like it's not a secondary nature to think about some of these factors. But it's really cool about how, I mean, it just seems eye opening the way you're telling me too about like the things that you're able to learn. So, what were some of the next steps? Like this class, you fell in love with the idea of animal ethics and pursuing it. Where do you go with that? Where do you go from there?
Um, Originally, the plan was, I love animals, and I was like, let's go to I wanted to become a vet. Let's go to vet school, right? I can work with animals. I can, implement these practices in person. And while I was going to school, I didn't go to school full time because I couldn't afford to go to university full time. And, where's the money coming from? So I was working. I work at a farm. I work with animals. And so I was working part time at the farm, going to school part time. And um, vet school didn't want me because I was not a full time student. Even though I had the grades, even though I had the experience, I volunteered at a vet clinic for an entire summer. They basically said, no, you weren't a full time student. And I actually called them out on it. I was like, so you're saying because of my socioeconomic background, because I didn't have very well off parents that could fully pay for my schooling and I could school full time, you guys are not accepting me because I'm just not well off enough. and the lady was so incredibly uncomfortable on the phone, but she couldn't say no. And that's when I started realizing that I could have pursued vet school in other avenues, but I felt like that was life telling me what it was pointing me in a different direction. And I realized that I could use my platform here on Twitch to actually talk about these subjects and educate people and um, do good that way.
That is a really, really frustrating take that that's what you had to go through, right? It feels like almost at that point it wasn't really your decision, it was the decision of the institution.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I'm just really sorry you had to go through that. It's super, super frustrating, but we're all the better to having you here on Twitch to tell us about
Oh,
these.
absolutely.
Um, it's weird how sometimes the universe works itself out for the better.
Absolutely. And at the time, again, I could have pursued vet school in other ways, but it would have involved a lot of hurdles and obstacles. And if I was truly that determined, could have done it. But I was just like, how how committed are we to just jumping all over the place to get this? And if I don't know if you know, I don't know if it's the same thing for vets in America, but Canadian vets are like super underpaid, super overworked. There's not enough vets in the country for the pets that we have. And so I was like, why am I going out of my way to get an education and a job that is already going to be kicking me when I'm down?
Yeah. There's that, and also it's just as hard, if not harder, to go through veterinary school as it is medical school.
Yep.
And the
Yep.
cost too. So at least in the US, it all really, really adds up very quickly. Um,
Mhm.
so when you were doing the farm life in the same
Mhm.
time as doing the courses, did you see or feel things that you had taken in your ethics course that maybe you saw at the farmland that where things were done right or things that were done not as well as you maybe would have hoped now with that new lens of knowledge? Like, how did that change your view on farming?
Yeah, I would say for the most part, because I am on a smaller farm, we're able to like pay more attention to the animals. And so generally speaking, I would say my lens of the farm hasn't really changed that much. It's all been pretty good. I mean, if things were bad to begin with, I probably wouldn't have been working there. But it definitely I started paying attention more to like when the vet would come in and do procedures. And especially when we had new management come in, they were very, very, like make sure that we have anesthetic, make sure that we have analgesics to give the animals after the procedure so they're nice and comfortable. Um, and so it's all like I noticed this more. It was all already happening on the farm though, and it's just nice to know, stereotypical behaviors. So these are behaviors that animals perform when they're really, really stressed out, and these behaviors are a way of soothing themselves. And knowing what stereotypical behaviors are, and looking at our animals, and they're all happy, fat, enjoying life.
And like you said, it wasn't just a straight shot either in the ethics class, whereas just like here you do this and all the needs will be met. There was this like fine balance, right? Of like either direction that you're going in, it has to be
Hmm.
done in a right way that suits each particular and unique animal. Which again ties back to kind of your love of animals and ensuring that they are, being taken care of in the appropriate way. And
Hmm.
I just think that's a really cool like roundabout of how it like as a kid back to where you are now, like you're still fighting for animal rights.
Hmm.
And I think that's really
Absolutely.
special. Uh,
I'm very, very fortunate and grateful that I have this platform to be able to do it. And as you mentioned earlier, I didn't think in a million and one years that I'd be here on the front page of Twitch talking about fish conservation, sustainability, and aquaculture.
yeah, so let's we are gonna get back to the story of Ultrasaurus as well, but let's do a little bit of a rabbit hole on fish sustainability and aquaculture. How did you get excited and like starting to look into fish breeding? Because that seems pretty different than your regular old farming with the chickens and the cows. Like, what was it that attracted you towards the fish side of things?
I think I remember actually in elementary school I read a book, and it was a fiction book, but it was a story about a salmon, and she had a name. I can't remember what it was, but you followed her life cycle, and just reading about. all of the things that the salmon had to do and endure and go through it. And at the end of the day, she died to give life to the next generation. Like, that stuck with me. I was like, whoa, that's amazing and incredible. And so, any opportunity I had to just learn about the ocean, especially like I've always loved salmon. I think they're so fascinating and so interesting. Yeah. So again, talking about taking courses that interest you. I took courses on aquaculture and courses on ocean pollution and ocean conservation and sustainability in university, and like I love those courses so much. I was like, this is the information that I would love to learn, and so that's kind of where that came from.
Did you have any lab experience with fish?
Yeah, so in university, I took some really, really cool courses where we basically did like DNA sampling and analysis of different salmon species, specifically like salmon that you would buy at the grocery store or that you would get in your sushi. And we basically did that to um, analyze if the species of salmon that you purchased was indeed that species of salmon.
How often so that represents a need, right? To be able to do something like that. How often is it the case where the thing that you're buying is not the thing that you're buying?
At least with my class and the other sections, or even just historically, it's come up very sparingly. It hasn't come up very much. There's maybe one group out of all of the sections where there's something that's a little off. My samples, so I goodness, what did I send you? We sampled sockeye salmon and we did coho, I think. That's what we were supposed to get at the grocery store. And the lady was so confused. I was like, I just need a small piece of the salmon. She's like, what? And I'm like, no, like this much. And she's like, why do you need only this much salmon? Just couldn't understand. Um, and our coho actually tested positive as rainbow trout. Now, I don't think anything bad was happening. I actually like later looked up what does rainbow trout look like. I actually didn't know. It looks like salmon. The meat looks like salmon. So someone goofed. Nothing bad, but in two separate groups that they purchased salmon from not the same store but the same chain. I can't remember what salmon they were supposed to have, but it came up positive for some other species. And both these people, it came positive for Chinook salmon, which, A, it's not the same store, two different stores, but the same chain. And they both get this result. Something happened. And I don't think it was the grocery store's fault, but Chinook salmon, if you guys don't know this, they are kind of a very highly regulated wild Pacific salmon, specifically because they are one of the major food sources of the southern resident killer whales. And so we need to make sure that A, we're not overfishing them, but B, we're only fishing them during times where it's not interfering with the orcas' like natural migration or feeding habits. And I'm pretty sure someone up the chain was fishing Chinook salmon and passing it off as not Chinook salmon because they were not supposed to be fishing it.
So it's interesting that there's also different species of salmon because when I've been to the grocery store, at least on the East Coast, it's like, oh, hey, here is Atlantic salmon, right?
Hmm.
And that's just the takeaway. That's all that you can find. But it's interesting that there's regional differences, right? And there's different seasonalities of when you can harvest
Hmm.
them. So how does that lead to how you can harvest them and when you can? And why is that important to think about?
Yeah, and so I don't know the specifics, but you basically look at the population of salmon and you want to look and make sure that you have a sustainable population of them so that they can continue to breed and create new salmon. There is a kind of a graph that fisheries use, and it's called, I believe it's a maximum sustainable yield. And you look at population, and you're not counting the individuals, you're examining the rate of growth. And so that's basically examining how many salmon are being produced each year. And what's important about that is there's basically a graph where if you're below the maximum sustainable yield, you don't want to fish because the growth rate is low. Anything within the maximum sustainable yield or more, you're actually that is sustainable fishing because naturally, if you let the population grow to, the maximum number of salmon, sure, that's fine. But, the population is always fluctuating because there's, the more salmon you have, the less food is available for them. There's just more likely, more fish, they're getting predated. And so as long as you keep them within a set range, the population actually stays fairly stable because they're reproducing and increasing the population at the maximum rate. It's not perfect because, I don't know, weather disasters happen, things happen, life happens. And so, we're not always going to have that perfect graph and perfect points, but that's what fisheries try to do. They try to find that range and stay within that range. And so if a fish is below that range, you can't fish it. I think for several years, I might be wrong, but it's been a very, very, very long time since the west coast of Canada has been able to go out fishing for sockeye salmon in certain areas. Certain populations have been like so incredibly decimated that you'll see fishing boats with licenses that expired 5, 6, 7 years ago because they haven't been able to renew it because the fisheries for that specific stock in that area haven't reopened.
So, when showing and talking about these numbers, why is it important to think about beyond just like what is the ramifications of overfishing? What is the ramifications of overeating? It's not just to us, right? Like we mentioned that there is this other kind of salmon that we don't end up eating because they're about affecting the orcas' health that are feeding on them. So how does sustainability come into play here?
Yeah, so I mean, when you have a smaller population and you're below that maximum sustainable yield, it's really hard to get the population back up to a healthy amount. Um, and so you never want to reach that point. And then that's what you get through overfishing and overconsumption. And a lot of the private, like the individually owned fishermen, that's their livelihood. If the DFO, which is what governs a lot of the fisheries in Canada, says, "Oh yeah, no, the population's too low. You can't fish that." That's not good for them. That's income. That's loss of income. They maintaining the population and maintaining that healthy population is just as important to the fishermen for their livelihood as it is for sustainability. And in terms of why we want that population, I mean, we want to save all of the animals. All animals are lovely and fantastic, but especially salmon. Salmon are a keystone species. A keystone species are like very critical for their environment and ecosystem in terms of the organisms that they interact with, or just even how they interact with the environment on a abiotic way in terms of nutrient cycling. Sorry, I'm like trying to find better ways to like say that without using those words, but their salmon are very, very important for the nitrogen cycle too, on both in the ocean and on the land. And so when we disrupt this and we fish too many of them, it disrupts actually a lot of different ecosystems and cycles and things on land and in the ocean.
So when we were chatting about this idea, we mentioned the idea of sustainable farming. And with
Yeah.
respect to what that does with fish. So what is there a specific kind of definition or terminology where sustainable farming applies to what we need to do or how we need to do with the fish?
Yeah. And so I would say on one hand, going out and fishing wild caught fish, it's not actually necessarily a bad thing. It's not necessarily unsustainable. You have to fish in a sustainable way. And as we mentioned before, that part of that is maintaining the maximum sustainable yield, but also it's how you fish. There's different methods of fishing, and different methods have different effects on the environment. I believe Trawling is one of the worst ones because you basically take this big net and you drag it across the ocean floor and it completely decimates and ruins everything on the ocean floor. So that's not good. And certain forms of fishing, I think I mentioned this, have a level of bycatch. Bycatch is you basically catch species that you had not been targeting. And so if I was fishing for halibut and I caught a bunch of rock cod or rockfish, that's bycatch. Turtles would be bycatch. Dolphins would be bycatch. Anything that is not what you had intended to catch is bycatch. And so certain methods of fishing, like hook and line, are very effective at reducing the level of bycatch that you have to. But on the flip side of that, there is aquaculture. It is literally farming salmon and farming fish. And I don't know if people are catching onto it now more because there's been more and more news coverage of it, but there's two types of aquaculture. For specifically, we're talking about salmon right now. There's open sea net pens, which is basically pretty self-explanatory. They just have big nets in the ocean. They have a bunch of salmon, and they don't have to worry about water regulation or pH or any of that stuff because it's in the ocean. There's no barrier. The water goes right through. And there's
and the fish are kept like in a container of some sort, right? So it's like
exactly
the
just netting.
water's filtering and like there's waves going and it's just like
Yeah.
it's like the Marvel prison, right? They're on the raft.
Yep. Yep. Exactly. And then the other type of aquaculture is on land, which is a lot more expensive because now you're having to filter the water and make sure the water conditions and parameters are within standard. Now you have to clean it and do all this stuff. And open CNET aquaculture is really, really bad for the environment. And it's actually like it's killing wild salmon.
So
It's not good.
So why is that? Because one would maybe naively think like, hey, they're outside, they're in the ocean. We've got just this area netted off. They can swim around, they can eat. The pH and everything is balanced just how they like it because it's natural. Like, why is it then they're actively then dying off? It seems almost a little, at face value, counterintuitive.
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially, and this applies to anything in agriculture, not just fish. When you have a high concentration of animals in a small space, it is basically a breeding ground for bacteria, viruses, parasites. They can hop easily from host to host, and it can become pretty prolific in the CNET. And so a lot of these farmed salmon, they're having to deal with, these viruses and these parasites, specifically sea lice. And that's fine for the salmon in the pen. Like, we can treat them or we can remove those ones out. But the issue is with these open sea nets is often you have migrations of wild salmon that pass these nets. And for those of you that don't know the salmon life cycle, when salmon, so they start from an egg and then they turn into an alevin, which is like a little tiny fish with an egg sac. And then they go from fry to smolts. Smolts are the ones that make the transition from freshwater to saltwater, because salmon are born and raised in little streams. And these smolts don't have the thick, tough scales that adult salmon do. So their skin, flesh scales are a lot more easier to penetrate by sea lice. And not only that, but when you're making that transition from freshwater to saltwater, that's taxing. You're literally having to change the entire way your metabolism works. And so they're already weak. They've got like a thin skin. And so they're like particularly susceptible to sea lice when they migrate through these areas that are close to these sea pens. On the flip side, when you have adult salmon returning to these streams to spawn and reproduce, they're having to do the backwards thing. They've got the scales, which is nice. Like, we're a little bit more protected from sea lice, but again, we're having to completely change our metabolism to go from saltwater to freshwater. And salmon, when they're migrating back and they're ready to spawn, they actually stop eating and they slowly start like decomposing, deteriorating, because the only thing on their mind is get to the spawning site and reproduce. And so a lot of them are very susceptible to like certain anemia viruses. They don't even make it to the spawning grounds because they get sick with the viruses that they catch from one of these sea pens and they die.
Wow. And so it's not just, is it fair to say that the ones in the sea pens might also be dying because they're highly concentrated and you can imagine disease spread out, but also it's the fish that are going past these sites are just
Mm-hmm.
picking up these disease states and then being able
Yeah.
to be wiped out. And it seems like you said, in both directions. So the ones that are leaving that need to grow up to eventually come back, right, get
Mm-hmm.
affected with the sea lice, and then the ones that are going back to finally lay the eggs to be able to continue the
Yeah.
cycle are then also dying off.
So they're getting double whammied.
So is then the solution to grow them up terrestrially? Like you said, it's more expensive, but then we
Mm-hmm.
at least eradicate that part. Is that a worthwhile reason to go in and do this?
Um, that would be more ideal in a perfect world. I don't know the costs involved, but that's why we do open CNET pens, is because it's more affordable. I think I haven't actually, in purchasing farmed salmon, seen a difference in the information as to whether it's like open CNET or on land. But if consumers had that information available, that would be a way of encouraging people to, hey, like purchase the salmon that comes from on land versus in the water. And another concern of these open sea nets is a lot of the salmon that they use for farming on the Pacific coast of North America are Atlantic salmon because they're easier to raise. They're a little bit more docile than the Pacific varieties. And there's a lot of concern with, well, what if an Atlantic salmon escapes and interbreeds with the Pacific salmon? And, we heard, oh, no, 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 that would never happen. And, Belinda, you can elaborate on this more, but they basically they've genetically modified these salmon so that they have an extra set of chromosomes. And so, like, if you think about mules and how mules can't reproduce, that was kind of the concept that they were going towards. Well, if we give them another set of chromosomes, they can't reproduce then. But that is not correct, and that is not what's happened.
And was I don't know if you know this. I don't know offhand, but was there any backlash about giving them an additional set of chromosomes in terms of now it's even more of a genetically modified quote unquote thing that you're eating? Was there any backlash just against that concept then?
Nothing on my radar, from what I know. But I mean, at the same time, this is just my personal opinion. Don't have seedless grapes and seedless watermelon then. Like it's the same thing, right?
Right. So that's the reason and that was a loaded question as well because there's right, they're trying to find alternatives to the Atlantic salmon, right? And saying like having them in the
Mhm.
fish nets, preventing interbreeding, if you could do something that makes it cost effective and makes it terrestrial, right? Maybe then it's a worldwide thing to do, right? And one thing that Ultra and I were talking about was that there is a other kind of genetically modified Atlantic salmon that has taken in a growth factor of the Chinook salmon. So of this other salmon, right, that Ultra is telling us about that isn't meant to be eaten because at certain parts of the year, like it is protected, don't fish it. It is taking a growth factor from that fish and then taking a Arctic fish's promoter region. What that means is it is a region of genetic regulation that turns on in every single cell type, and they put the two together. So now they turn on this growth factor in every single cell of your Atlantic salmon, and it makes it grow faster and bigger. It's the exact same fish, the exact same flavor, allegedly, but again, you've changed around some of the genetics of it in order to make it more cost effective because now you've cut the time in half for how long that you need it. So, I guess at what point, Ultra, is it ethical to modify the genome of an animal in order to be able to sustainably farm? And I know that's a question that we can't necessarily like, neither of us are going to quote answer it, right? But like what are your
Mhm.
thoughts on that kind of problem?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that I think of is, just looking at the animal, in terms of, is it physically healthy? Does it look stressed when we enhance its growth in that way? If it looks fine, it looks happy, I from that regard, I think that's fine. In situations with and we were chatting about this earlier with the broiler chickens, they've been selectively bred, to basically have super, super enhanced growth. Broiler chickens from egg to fully grown and ready to slaughter, I think it's like just a little over 2 weeks to get there. And it's an insane amount of growth. Like these chickens grow so fast, their bones and ligaments don't have time to adjust for this growth. And there's actually, when you buy chicken from the grocery store, especially like chicken breast, you can actually see these white lines on the meat. And that's just basic. I can't remember what specifically it was, but that's a result of that enhanced growth and the body not being able to like catch up with it. Um, and then my other concern would just be, with when we muck around with things, if it's in an open sea pen and it gets out and it starts breeding with wild populations, that's a whole other can of worms. And what does this mean for wild salmon if it has enhanced growth? That would concern me more, if anything else.
Yeah, I agree. It's in part because of the welfare of the animal, right? And so one question that's been posed a couple of times now is if you compare the health of a broiler chicken compared to these rapidly growing salmon, what do you feel like? Are those broiler chickens sourced in an ethical manner? Like, are they under a type of stress? Um, and what amount of stress for them is quote unquote acceptable, right? Because it seems
Hmm.
like from the images that we've looked at with the actual like physical changes in the meat of the chicken, it seems like there would be some kind of that's a stress, right? Like, yes, it's gonna be a tasty piece of chicken, but at the end of the day, that's probably stressing out the animals. So where does one draw the line on that?
Um, I
That's my
mean,
that's my answer
are we
too.
talking about the fish or are we talking about the chickens? Because that's there's two different systems. And I just wanted to, sorry, go back to correct what I've said. I just quickly Googled it because I couldn't remember. The broiler chickens can be raised as early as 4 weeks. Sorry, not 2 weeks. I'm going to take that back. Um, with the fish, I don't know. I would feel like if you have them, let's say on an on-land facility, if they grow faster, you have them in the tanks for less time. I mean, you could perceive it as more ethical because you're not enclosing them and housing them for as long. And again, like if we can't notice anything physically detrimental, I wouldn't see the issue with it. The other side of it, which is really interesting, is there are some people out there that, and there's nothing wrong with this opinion, by the way, just putting that out there, that they also just view it unethical that, like, oh, through enhanced growth, now the animal has a shorter lifespan. And, they feel like they don't live long enough on Earth. And so that's another really interesting viewpoint that doesn't quite resonate with me. I think the less time that they spend in these structures, buildings in our agriculture, the better, personally. But yeah, I was gonna say, especially with the chickens, you have a whole other bunch of problems when you raise chickens for they take longer to grow. How our systems are basically how they work is the entire area isn't cleaned. So you have your bedding, you have your chickens, and they're in there for 46 weeks, and then they're all collected, and then that's when you clean the entire facility. So what do you do when the chickens live longer? Right now, the current practices and the system doesn't account for that.
It's almost like the cleanliness like apex is right at that time where you're gonna harvest them. And afterwards, if they were to live longer, you maybe have to do like your standard of practice would have to change.
Yeah.
One
Um.
one question that's coming in from the chat as well is that
Mhm.
comparing the quality of life of either the chicken, right, or the salmon
Mhm.
in
Yeah.
that caretaking facility versus what happens in the wild, and how to kind of compare those two. And I feel like that's a difficult one as well, right? Because you can argue that the fish that you're storing on the above ground terrestrial facility don't have predatory pressures, right? They don't have the
Mhm.
pressure of getting food. They have clean water supply. In theory, they're not going to have a disease outbreak. But at the cost of being able to swim around, I think it's difficult too because we don't necessarily know what they perceive, right? Like, what is it
Mhm.
that they're perceiving in terms of the world, right? Like, how do they know that they're stuck in a container?
Yeah. Um, I would say definitely for chickens. I mean, I work with chickens. We have them on our farm. They're really intelligent little creatures. So I think for them, having them free range, having them out and about, which is not necessarily always possible in our farming systems, it would be great and it would make a difference to them. Um, Fish, salmon, I do not know. I could not answer that. From my own, I used to actually keep a lot of aquarium fish. I had like a 65-gallon tank. And I can tell you some of my fish were as dumb as a post, and some of them were actually really intelligent. Like, they would see me and they would, like, kind of beg for food, and they recognize who would feed them and who wouldn't feed them, and I don't know, it's I can't really answer that, but I don't know, for their sake, I hope that it makes no difference for them. Um, yeah.
It is one of those, like, loaded questions, right, that's near impossible to answer of how you know what perceptions are being brought in by a certain animal and how they're interpreting the world around them.
Mhm.
One thing that, people look at is to see if they can identify self from non-self. So if you look in a mirror, does
Mm,
that
yeah.
identify your reflection versus an animal that doesn't able to identify? There have been tests that suggest even a goldfish can identify something like this and themselves, like in a
Mhm.
mirror test. And so maybe it gets kinda to the perception of what is a viable field, right, of how large they need to be in order to not be stressed out, and maybe that's the best that we can do on
Mhm.
that front. I know one part about that we've considered in our chats on ethical farming is the amount of intake the animals have, right? So it doesn't matter,
Ooh.
and that's not just on the fish side, right, but also on the farm side too. If you're the amount that you're feeding them, right, could be have a
Mhm.
profound negative impact on the environment. And so, how do we account for something like that as well in this overall equation of sustainable farming?
Well, actually, aquaculture is quite good for that. If you were to eat, meat, fish is, like, one of the best ones that you could eat. I can't remember what exactly the ratio is, if it's, like, amount of food per amount of, like, fish produced, or if it was, like, protein. I can't remember, but it's basically like a one-to-one ratio with salmon in aquaculture, which is, like, really, really cool. It's one of the most efficient, sustainable forms of, like, meat that we can farm, and so, in terms of that, I would argue, like, if you were to just kick off something, get rid of beef. Beef is not sustainable, and fish is really, really sustainable, and I really do truly believe, like, I am a strong believer of I don't think it's reasonable to tell people, "Everybody just stop fishing wild fish." And A, a lot of the world, especially, countries, like, that are, less developed, like, a lot of their population, their people are dependent on fishing as a main source of food and protein and income. And again, when we talk about, like, that maximum sustainable yield, there is such thing as, like, sustainable fishing. We can catch wild fish in a way where it's actually not impacting the population or the species. It's possible. You can do it. But, like, a combination between finding a better way to do aquaculture where we're not disturbing the wild species, versus fishing out in the wild. Like, I don't think one or the other is necessarily at this point better. I think both have their pros and cons, and there's ways that we can improve both systems. Do your research, find out where your fish come from. For me personally, when I go to a grocery store and I get prawns, I will not purchase prawns that are farmed in aquaculture. I will only purchase wild caught prawns because prawn aquaculture is one of the leading causes for the decimation of mangrove forests, which are really, really important for our ecosystem. They're actually a huge source of a carbon sink, so taking carbon from the atmosphere and putting it back into like the vegetation, the water, the ground. But they're also like homes to like so many different species of animals, like, dolphins and all sorts of fun things. And it's really sad that like these forests are being destroyed for these prawn farms. And so, what was actually really interesting too, that I read is that these prawn farms don't even really like benefit the locals. The one person who owns the whole farm is like making a lot of money, but the people that they hired to work on these farms are like barely making anything too. So it's not even like good for the local economy.
It's just good for that one person doing all the sales.
Mm-hmm.
So, do you have any advice, Ultra, for someone wanting to do their own research on something like this? Like, if I'm buying product, let's say, to feed the family, right? Like some kind
Mm-hmm.
of fish product or something along those lines. Like, where does one look to get information on if something is sustainably farmed, and how do I best interpret something like that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So you have to be your own best advocate and detective because there is something called greenwashing, and greenwashing is where products are made to look visually more sustainable and better for the environment when actually they're not. And especially with fish products, the color blue is used a lot. Just for some reason we think that's just more sustainable in our brains.
So, as a
Look up.
positive color,
Mhm,
something that might not have been done sustainably is colored nice
mhm,
blue because it's
mhm.
some kind of association in our brains.
Yeah, and you'll see like little logos or badges, and you might think off the top of your head like, oh, it's got like some certification on it, must be good. I've seen packages where if you look it up, it's actually just like the company logo of their warehouse.
Oh
But it
no.
doesn't say that on the bag. It doesn't say that on the bag. But if you do your research, it's like, oh, that's not an accreditation or a certification. That's literally just their logo. But it looks like, oh, it's more sustainable. Um, do your research, and even I don't want to name the brands right now. Maybe later in the stream we'll talk about the brands, but out of curiosity, I some of the cat food that I feed my cat, I saw because I knew this talk was coming up. I saw that it said sustainable tuna. I'm like, oh, that's cool. What does that mean? And I tried to. I'm gonna say, guys, is if it takes you a lot of deep diving and a lot of research to try to figure out if something is sustainable or not, you probably have better options because it shouldn't be that hard to find the information that you need. And so, well, I literally wrote down the process in which I had to try to find out like what makes this sustainable. What does this mean? It was like a 45-minute endeavor for this one product.
It feels like
Where is
something
it?
that it should just be written on there, right? Like I remember the catchphrase
Mm-hmm.
when I was a kid was dolphin safe.
Mm-hmm.
It should almost be something that simple.
Mm-hmm. But I would even like argue, when they say dolphin safe, like what does that mean? Does
That
that mean you catch 20% less dolphins, but you're still catching dolphins? Like, that's what you really got to look into things and labeling because like it's very non-descriptive on they can't give you all that information on the product. They can't. Um, so for this sustainable tuna cat food, I go to their website and it doesn't say anything. They have a sustainability website which takes you to how to recycle your cat food container,
okay, at least that's
which is
something.
not helpful. But it turns out that that company is the main parent company. So I went to their homepage and it said, "Oh, well, according to the Sustainable Seafood Coalition, it's sustainable." And I was like, What does that mean?" Like
So
that still doesn't tell me anything.
it's someone
And it
else's
says,
definition that they're sustainable by, but they're not defining who that is. Okay.
"Oh, wait, oh, Belinda goes deeper than that." So then I'm like, okay, well, what defines the Sustainable Seafood Coalition? And it's like, well, the source fishery has to be consistent with the principles and standards of the codes and conduct of the FAO, which is like a major global organization. I'm like, okay, that's cool. What is what does that mean? And basically, a lot of the wording for the principles of the FAO for responsible fisheries is kind of wishy-washy. And I'm not saying it's not good, but it's like they basically, the state where the fishery is should make the best effort to do this, should make the best effort to do that, should make, like, it's all about effort and trying, not, no, you actually need to hit certain numbers. You need to do certain things. You need to fish things in certain ways. And so it was very nondescript. And I'm like, I'm sure some states are doing a good job, but couldn't a state just say, oh, well, this is the best we can do? Okay. Like, it doesn't.
Right. If there's not an actual goal, there's no reason to actually do it then, right? If like,
It's
yeah, we're trying. We can't make any of this, but we're trying. That feels a little disingenuous.
in a, again, like, without doing an even deeper deep dive, I can't actually speak to, like, how effective this is or, like, how well this is implemented. So I don't, at the same time, I don't want to poo-poo it. I just genuinely don't know. Like, the information that I found, it didn't tell me enough as a consumer. Okay, this, you're just saying it's sustainable. Great. And I'm sure if I did a deep dive into, okay, where was this tuna caught? What state is this responsible for this? What are the state's policies? What are the, you would find more information, but that's just a lot of hurdles and obstacles for one question.
Right,
Whereas another brand, sorry,
well,
continue.
isn't it with the cat food too? It's not necessarily a single source from a particular state as well. It's more like multiple places that it's coming in from. At least I looked into Fancy Feast,
Mm-hmm.
and for Fancy Feast that my cats eat, they are coming from, it seems like, a bunch of different sources to the facility where they're doing the processing. So I would feel that that would even make it even harder to then standardize something if it's like a state specific thing, whether it be province in Canada, state in the
Mm-hmm.
US, right? And the compare and contrast between those two.
Mm-hmm. Um, I think I remember reading something about they can guarantee that like 90% of the fish came from a single source, with, at least for this brand, which is, I don't know if that's necessarily a good thing or not, but they did actually mention that with the sources.
Okay, that's cool.
But actually, there's another brand that I looked up for. This is tuna for people, and they've got a really great system where there's like a number associated with the can, and you can go on their website and you can look up the number, and it tells you exactly where it was fished, how it was fished, when it was fished, what boat picked it up. Like, it gives you so much. I feel like I'm reading the life story. They have more information about this can of tuna than I even know about myself. And so, but that information was super accessible,
Mhm.
super easy to find. Like, it took me 2 seconds. I didn't have to search or dig. Simple, easy. Um, there are other accreditations, like I think it's MSC. That is a good labeling, brand, and certification for finding like sustainable MCS, MSC. Sorry, I'm mixing things up here, but there are certain certifications where you can generally trust that if the food that you're purchasing is certified by it, that you can actually look into their codes and practices and policies and like know that it was sustainable and done in a good way. That's the website for the MSC. So it's the Marine Stewardship Council, and they do a lot of certifications for fish products and fisheries, and the information is like pretty easy to read and understand, and like they're definitely like one of the accreditations where if you see that on a fish package, it's usually pretty sustainable.
And is this one that's international?
Ooh. Uh, that's a good question.
It looks
It's
like
definitely in
it.
the States.
Yeah, it looks like. Well, it looks like a quick read. Their mission statement involves an international statement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, it does look like it is international. That's really cool.
Neat.
In this sustainability, and as we're trying to do, oh, here we go. Sharky has a loaded question for you. Is
Oh God.
sustainable commercial fishing even realistic with 8 billion people on the planet?
It Yeah, I would say it is realistic. Um, I think a part of that is, as consumers, like, we're not having fish for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Like, we're having fish in moderation. But there's definitely a growing movement to take fishing, wild caught fish, and move away from like a more commercial industry to individual fishermen. Individual fishermen are, again, I mentioned this earlier, they're more invested in the stock of fish. It's their livelihood. They care, whereas a big company might not be as invested or might not care as much. And so there are actually some like fishery success stories where, changes and things have been implemented to actually save a stock of fish. And this was all done through sustainable fishing practices. I believe it is. What type of prawn was it? It was in Australia. And essentially, they fished the heck out of these prawns. The Australia's northern prawn fishery. They fished them all year round. They fished them as much as they could. They even, through the use of like refrigeration, and they would have like motherships that would store all of the prawns on it, and they would have smaller fisher boats go out, get the prawns, come back, drop them off in the mothership, and go back, which like just really enhanced the effectiveness of completely decimating this stock of prawn. And people were like, "Oh well, we're running out of these guys. Their population is not good." And so they actually gave more incentive and more power to smaller fisheries, local fishermen to basically, can't remember exactly the specifics, but through the use of policies and grants, it made it so that smaller fishermen had more of a say in what is it called? Is buy-in something owner buy-in, I think. But they basically had more of a buy-in into the industry, and they're more invested in the stock, and they would have like meetings to talk about like the stock and how much was being fished and plans and strategies. And this was all a part of like a council where they would have like board meetings to talk about this stuff. And through use of monitoring the population, um, only fishing the prawns in certain areas, and having, it's called like temporal restrictions, and so only certain times of the year you could fish them. But also like, you know, going away from those big commercial motherships to like just regular fishing boats that the fishermen own. They've seen a huge increase in the stock of these prawns, and it's actually like saved that entire industry.
That is quite remarkable. Also, the just one point that you said earlier tonight that's kind of hit me a couple of times now is the sustainability from the feeding perspective of these animals, right? For fish like
Mm-hmm.
aquaculture, where it's like almost that 1-to-1 ratio of the amount of food that they're feeding them. The fish that
Mm-hmm.
we were talking about earlier tonight that's being genetically modified, so the Atlantic salmon that has some Chinook salmon in it, plus a deep sea dwelling fish, actually needs about half the amount of food as a regular Atlantic salmon. And so that seems like
Huh.
even cooler of a result
Yeah.
because they need even less food in order for them to continue growing to double the size.
That's super interesting.
So with that knowledge in mind, I feel like it would be an even cooler methodology to be able to really like hone in on that type of fish and to
Mm-hmm.
make it so that you're harvesting again from like that terrestrial site. And one place that was utilizing these fish is actually a the site was in Indiana. And the reason for that is so apparently this fish had been approved in Canada in the 80s
Mm-hmm.
to be grown and to be fed to people, but in the US it took another 30 years before anyone was okay with it. And one of the conditions
Yeah.
was to be able to grow it again where there's no access to ocean water. And that's a little bit of what you were saying too tonight about like, well, what would end up happening is if if they got out and they ended up mixing, what would the ending
Mm-hmm.
result of that be? And so it is interesting that like it's already a beneficial thing in terms of the food resources, and now they've incorporated this higher level of efficiency into their metabolism so they can grow
Mm-hmm.
with less food. And so I feel like that might even to get to Shark Geek's question and even a better avenue of sustainability to it. Like again with these
Mm-hmm.
modifications. I think it gets to the point of, for you, at what point are we farming the Atlantic salmon in one of these like big terrestrial tanks versus we're just farming some kind of genetically modified lab creature for food? And at what point does the sustainable farming and the bioethics that we held for the salmon be altered for this new thing? Is there a line there?
It's really hard. I don't know. Like I'm so lost in it because like this is stuff that I didn't learn about. I didn't even know that this was a thing until we were talking about it. But
It's one
I
of those.
think I was just gonna say I just wanted to comment back on something that you said where they required less food. Is that because they're like growing faster, so less energy is needed for just like metabolic activity because they're just not. I don't know if I'm asking this properly.
So it seems like there's something about the metabolomic gene that they've taken from the Chinook
Yeah.
salmon, because something about those salmon, their metabolism's just more efficient. So if you were to harvest Chinook salmon
Oh.
in general, like let's say we could do
Mhm,
that, those
mhm.
animals fundamentally require less food than when you're harvesting and doing the aquaculture of the Atlantic salmon. And so just putting in that gene seems to reduce the overall load these animals need in terms of food. Which again, it's like you're making it more efficient in terms of its metabolism, but not only more efficient, but it's becoming more, I don't know, maybe more of a viable option. Like you were saying, was
Mhm.
it stay off of beef if we're gonna drop something? Because
Beef is so bad.
right, the amount of
I mean,
food.
I'm gonna have a hard time letting it go, but like objectively, it's really bad for the environment.
No, don't let it go. Don't let, like, I think that's could you give us a little glean into like what all is negative from eating a cow versus like the negatives of maybe one of these salmon?
Yeah, and so for the salmon, for the most part, in aquaculture, you feed them pellets, which is just like a combination of things that have high protein in it. And that's all you need to feed them. That's it. Just these protein pellets. They actually add a little bit of, it's not great, red dye into these pellets because out in the wild, the fish are naturally like eating all sorts of like fun little buggy bugs and little fish, which give them their natural bright and rich red color. But in aquaculture, the pellets, if you just feed them, their meat comes out very dull and almost gray, which consumers, I don't think anyone goes to a grocery store and wants to buy gray salmon. And so they do add a little bit of food coloring to it.
Okay.
Um, but cows, they require an incredible amount of just water to drink, especially with beef cattle. They require like acres and acres and acres for them to roam and graze and rear their young. And like a lot of deforestation happens when you have these large properties for these cows, as well as a lot of what these cows are fed. You could argue that, you're growing corn and wheat and whatnot, soy that gets fed to the cows, but it's like, okay, well, we could also just grow the soy, wheat, and corn for ourselves and eat that. So it's kind of getting processed through the cow, and it's just a lot of resources, a lot of carbon gets used up in raising beef cattle. And so just from like a perspective of water usage, land, deforestation, or just even producing food like that, the amount of food that goes into feeding a cow that then gets that we consume, the ratio, the efficiency of the food going into the cow versus the food that we get out of it, it's just not there like it is with fish.
That is a very like well put image too of like thinking about all that's being grown for the cow to eat, for you just basically to push through the cow and then to be end up like, harvesting the cow itself. Like it's almost doubling, at least minimum, right? The impact on the environment. It probably more because of the methane release as well. Like there's studies attempting to train cows to like use the restroom in certain facilities that can be like trapping, that it's not releasing as much gas, which is also wild to think about, that the number of animals that we're having on farms and how they relate to us in terms of how we're eating affects the environment in like a global
Mhm.
warming kind of way.
Mhm. Yep. No, absolutely. So yeah, no, fish are definitely we need to like harvest them sustainably. We need to think about conservation, but at the same time, in the grand scheme of the world and our climate, fish are better for us to be consuming than beef.
So if as much as we know about this genetically modified fish, which is
Mhm.
there is for Chad, there is no publication on this genetically modified fish. This is all behind patent law, all kinds of barriers. All that we have is some announcements off their website of this is how it works, and a few papers that have taken what is that gene regulatory region from the deep water fish that says like if we use this part of the gene, it's going to turn on in every cell. They've taken that genetic element and attached a luciferase to it, so it turns on a certain light to show that yes, it turns on in all cells. So, okay, we know that it maybe turns on in all cells. We know that it has less food that it needs. We know that they're made to be sterile in the adult stage, right? Like all these positive things are coming into play. So why do you think Ultra, and this is obvious, again, a lot of these conversations, y'all, that we're having tonight, we're not going to solve, right? These are a lot of
Yeah.
issues that will continue to be issues even after tonight, unfortunately. We're not going to come up with the answer. But why do you think there's so much hesitancy to it? Because a lot of the things that we've talked about that are negatives in terms of like what one needs, like what could be detracting from sustainable farming seem to be answered by this genetically modified fish. So why then the hesitancy around it?
We're going more into people ethics here.
Well, so is people ethics something that is easy to disentangle from farming ethics?
They're both separate and the same sometimes. It depends on how you view things, right? I mean, there's the ethics of just objectively the treatment of an animal and its quality of life, and there's people's perception of it. Um, but in terms of like these GMOs, I think a part of the reason is just like I think a lot of people don't understand the science behind it. They can't visualize what's happening. Like especially with if you don't mind me mentioning, like with the COVID vaccine, it was like an mRNA vaccine. Like that scared a lot of people because they're like, what does that mean? I don't know what that means. That's different, right? And so I think it's just a lack of understanding how these systems work. And I would also argue there have been points in history, and like not long history, but recent history, where, we've come up with things that I can't remember if it was like gene editing, but we gave there's a case of giving children something to I can't remember they had some sort of genetic disorder and it was supposed to fix that. And
The
do you know what I'm
two
talking?
the two kids out of China that were genetically modified against the AIDS virus, and then they were
No.
exposed to the AIDS virus as well.
Oh goodness. No, it's not that example. I can't remember specifically what it was, but it was actually a group of 15, 20 kids, and whatever they added it did fix their deficiency. Like they weren't able to produce a certain hormone or protein. I can't remember what, but they ended up all getting some sort of cancer like very shortly after. And so,
The off-target effects of something like that.
yeah. And so, like, I think, when situations like that happen, like, that's super bad and that's awful. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, I don't support things like that, but um, it's you hear those stories and you hear, well, their genes were edited, they were genetically modified, and look at what happened, right? I don't think it's fair to judge all GMOs under that light, but I can understand the hesitancy. And, like, working with genes, working with DNA, it's a powerful thing. Like, don't underestimate it. But at the same time, we have a lot of science, we have a lot of technology, we do a lot of testing. We kind of like fully understand these systems a lot more than we ever did before. And so, um, yeah, I think it just comes down to like a lack of understanding what exactly is being edited and changed and what that means.
Maybe to the accessibility to the terminology, the accessibility to what's going on and be able to ask that question versus just being presented with, well, here you go.
Yeah, no, exactly.
And it's something that I've heard you say, and we say it here as well as be skeptical about everything. And
Hmm.
because, like you said, if there's all these off-target effects that end up being something really bad, like cancer, it's important to be a skeptic when coming to these situations. So it's while maybe at face value, it seems like this would be great to utilize these genetically modified fish, and they could still be. It's important to be able to ask questions and to be cautious if you so choose.
Mhm. Absolutely. Yeah.
One thing that we talked about Ultra in our discussion beforehand was in terms of sustainable farming, and you mentioned this as well, these smaller farms that end up taking
Mhm.
control, right? And that has gives you this level of ownership. How does that translate to when it's a cultural effect as well? Because there are also cultures where and you kind of alluded to this at the beginning of our chat where it gets things to be quite complicated, right? Of certain cultural values and norms are saying that, we need to be able to fish X, Y, and Z because it's our heritage versus what the sustainability argument might say could be very different. So where is the boundary between those?
Yeah, especially in, Canada, there's a lot of, like, indigenous rights to fish, and goodness, sorry, I know a lot of this information, like, kind of surface level. The nitty-gritty details, have escaped me. It's been a few years since I really studied this stuff, but there was, like, a major case in Canada that was taken to court where, there was an indigenous individual who I can't remember if they were fishing at the wrong time or they were fishing too much or whatnot, but basically, government was like, "No, you can't do that. You can't fish this stuff." And he's like, "Well, actually, we had the right to do this, and we were doing this anyways, and this was a part of our culture, and you guys took away that right." And yeah, it's a very famous court battle that happened where he ended up winning, which is monumental and fantastic. But culturally, fish is actually really important to a lot of different nations and a lot of different cultures, and it's really hard to just say, "Yes, just don't eat fish anymore." Okay, well, a lot of these nations, like, the fish is the only way that they can actually get their protein. Fish is also just really it is a healthy food for you to have. It's full of omega-3s, all sorts of great stuff in it, and so it's especially working with nations where, there's a lot of exploitation of the fishermen, a lot of exploitation of the fisheries. It's all about trying to work with the locals and finding a way to make sure that both the fish they're still being fished, but finding ways to do it sustainably in a way that also still benefits the locals and incentivizes, not, overfishing or just catching every single thing we get.
So it's an extremely delicate balance of like preserving nature and making sure that everything stays in that like intermediate zone, right? Of not
Maximum sustainable yield. Yeah,
exactly.
exactly. And um I might say something here that is controversial and people you don't have to agree with me. I'm just stating a fact and a viewpoint, but I think this was like one of the coolest takeaways from my ocean conservation and sustainability course. So when you have things like there's a good word for it, but animal products that don't actually benefit people, but there's like a cultural tie to it or a belief that it helps them, heals them, all this sort of stuff. And especially here in Western society, we go, okay, just stop doing that. That it does nothing. You're decimating this animal. Like, we don't agree with this. That's bad. That's horrible. Stop. Again, it's really hard to tell a group of people, yeah, don't do that. Stop that. We know you value it, but stop. But the better thing that we can do, and especially like I'm thinking of like seahorse fishing and collecting seahorses for all sorts of medicinal reasons. The better approach is not villainizing the people, not telling them stop doing that. And the thing is, you can make it illegal. Okay, you can't fish seahorse anymore. Sorry, people are still gonna do it. They're gonna find ways to do it illegally, and it's gonna be unregulated. The key is to make change is to work with the locals and basically be like, hey, this seahorse, this medicine that you value, that you think is really important to you, if you keep fishing it this way, you're not going to have any. Let's find a way where I mean, this is why it's a touchy subject because it's like, is there such thing as fishing seahorses sustainably? I don't know. But are there ways of doing it that are less destructive and can be managed a little bit more? Yes. And so I'm just using that specific example, but it extends to a lot of different species and fish and like parts of the world where it's it's a really interesting mindset, and it actually I had not ever considered viewing it from that perspective before, because I was very much a person of that's bad, stop that. It's not healing you, it's not doing anything for you, but that doesn't matter to the locals. That doesn't matter to that group of people. They're still going to be doing it anyways. But let's find a way to work together to do this in a more sustainable way.
And it's not just the ocean life. That I feel like that principle can apply to a lot of other like terrestrial animals as well, right? Where again, it's
Yep.
like you said, it's super easy. I know I was guilty of it as a kid. Be like, well, stop that. What are you doing? Like that
Yeah.
animal, you should leave that animal alone. But like you said, like the buy-in for that isn't gonna be immediate. And I feel like that principle that you're illustrating there is the same principle to get buy-in for there to be something like sustainable in terms of any kind of farming, right?
Yeah.
It can't just be
Exactly.
like that same like it. And here we're not antagonizing anyone, right? It's like
Hmm.
there's not a group of people who are doing something. It's just like, oh, we should do this thing, and people aren't gonna buy into it, farmers, businesses, or anything, unless you go in that kind of like stepwise route, how kind of you're explaining for that buy-in to happen.
Hmm.
It,
And I was just gonna say, like, I just wish that was the more popular narrative, because we're just I'm gonna be quite honest, as someone who's Chinese, there's kind of a lot of like racist undertones in the sentiments and feelings towards what happens, and I don't agree with the harvesting of certain animals, certain products, certain ingredients, but um definitely it's a mindset. But I do feel to some degree, when people talk about these things, there's a lot of undertones of racism to it too.
is there this again, y'all? We are chatting a lot of questions tonight that do not have answers. Do you have any insight as to how to combat something like that? Like with those
um
undertones, like is there like what is a reasonable way to try to get rid of that? And I saw your eyes flash like, oh God, change like it
it's
short of changing
hard.
humanity, right? Like what does
Yeah.
one suggest in doing that?
I'm just trying to think of what I do personally. I think this goes so beyond animal ethics and what we're talking about too, but essentially, I think it starts from yourself and observing yourself and your behaviors and what you do. Like, when you tell a story about what happened, do you need to list the races of the people in the story? When you talk about products and the quality of them, do you need to generalize and specify, oh, this product from this location? There's a lot of racial, like, microaggressions that happen in our daily lives, that until you become self-aware of them, and people, I'm not, I feel like I've been guilty of it too, and I've been more self-conscious, and just I think working on yourself is definitely a good step for that, because a lot of the things that are said that are kind of microaggressions are very normalized, and they're not interpreted as being racist, but it kind of just adds to that narrative, it adds to that tone, it adds to that viewpoint in the grand scheme of things. And so um at least for me, like, when I've been, talking to you about these subjects, I'm not talking about any country or any race or any culture. We're generically talking about it because it's not just one place. It's different places, different cultures, different places. But the importance of what I'm sharing has nothing to do with the race or the location or the culture, right?
I think that's really, really well said because what we're trying to talk about here and what we're trying to raise awareness of transcends national boundaries and race. Like
Mm-hmm.
this is a human issue. Like it is part of the human condition to need to eat, right?
Yep.
And so like you were saying, fish is a really good alternative for what we are having in our everyday lives. And if
Yep.
done right, it could be really beneficial for us like as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
Um would you mind Ultra like do we still have you for a little bit longer?
Oh, I'm hanging. We're chilling. I've got my tea. We're good.
Okay. Uh Because you have experience in terrestrial farming as well,
Mhm.
um, what is some of the compare and contrast, if you could tell us, where accountability for the welfare of the animal comes into play? Like, is there less known about aquatic animals when it comes to this? It almost feels like, or it seems to me, again, naive here, a little less studied.
Yeah, there are I'm just even talking about, like, as someone who used to, like, have aquariums. Man, I wish I could still have fish. I can't have them in my apartment. But, there are signs that fish have that they're stressed out. I think we know the signs in both aquatic animals and terrestrial animals, but I think how people value it is differently. We kind of view fish from the perspective of, oh, if they're stressed, we want to make sure they're not stressed because they'll probably die. We don't want them dying. But we don't actually stop to think, oh, they're in discomfort, they're in pain. Because I think there's still like a very strong belief that, like, oh, fish don't feel pain. They're fine.
So
Whatever, right?
that's the same mentality with insects as well. So what's been identified
Mm
is in insects, in fish, or these like quote lower level vertebrates, is
hmm.
that there's in humans there's two kinds of pain. Right? There's the pain that what happens when you touch a hot stove top, and in that millisecond when you take your hand off, if any of y'all have ever done that, that's not when the pain hits. Right? That's that rapid response of like, oh, I felt something and I'm gonna move my hand away, and that's called
Mhm.
nociception. That's nociceptive pain. And then there's a secondary pain that processes in your brain of like, oh God, I just put my hand on a stovetop, like that hurts. And what's interesting is that in insects and in fish, the first one has been proven that they have this
Mhm.
nociceptive pain, which isn't really pain, it's just reacting to a stimulus like a poke,
Mhm.
and not been proven the second level of pain. So if they don't have it, and this is something that we grapple with in the lab too, so that y'all, this isn't just like how Ultra's saying is for food. If you're doing research on these animals as well, you have a moral obligation to make sure that they're kept comfortable, right?
Mhm.
And so it's something that is struggled with in fish keeping in a research setting as well. Like, would that dictate change for how we keep them if it turns out they don't actually feel pain, they just have this touch sensation versus something like a mouse where it's like it has both types of pain receptors?
Think again, it comes down to, and we actually chatted about this in November. It comes down to who you are and what the animals are to you and your perception of them. And so, if you're a big company and you have a bunch of fish or a bunch of animals, you're not actually necessarily prioritizing the care and welfare of each individual animal. You're looking at them as a whole. Is the group good? Is the group happy? And that's your business, that's your priority. Whereas, me having a little aquarium, I'm going to be very concerned about each and every one of my little fish in there, right? Like that matters to me if I see one stressed out or, maybe it's in pain or sick. And so, it just comes down to like who's taking care of them and what their goal is. And like in a perfect world, we would care about, all of the individuals and all of their comfort. But, from a larger farming standpoint, if a lot of your fish are showing signs of stress and are sick, that's your sign to, hey, check the water parameters. What's going on? Are they sick? Do they have a virus? Do they have bacteria? I don't know what, but that would be their time to step in, more or less because they just want to keep their stock healthy for their business, right?
Zebrafish are one of the commonly studied lab organisms, and Ultra, the exact same things that you were saying for maintenance of what happens in like the farm animals
Mhm.
for the fish is the same thing that's done in the lab for a zebrafish as well. They're separated, by millions of years of evolution, but it's still, you don't want them stressed because the experiments that you're going to be doing, if you have them
Mhm.
stressed, it's bad. And again, you're checking like the water composition, you're checking if there's viruses, there's bacteria. So it's interesting to hear like between the two of us, a lot of the healthcare needs for like or welfare needs for these animals, whether they be in the farm
Mhm.
setting or the lab setting, is the same. Granted, for different reasons, like
Yeah.
food versus the experiment, but it ends up becoming the exact same takeaway, which I think is really interesting.
I've got a fun fact. This is something that I wanted to talk about a little bit because when I learned this, I was like, "Whoa." Um, but do you know what part of the world has the highest level of biomass per square meter?
What is biomass?
I was not expecting you to throw that back at me. Bio Getting tested here. Biomass is the accumulative weight of all organic, alive contents in a certain area. So this could be like plants, this could be animals, this could be fungus, bacteria, insects, you name it. Anything that is alive would account for biomass.
All right, so I would naively say the Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
How big of an area are we talking? Like, is the
Um,
ocean an acceptable answer? Because I feel like that's a very broad answer.
mm-hmm. So it is a specific biome type, and it's in a very specific part of the world.
The Mariana Trench. Then
So you were
we.
almost there. So it's not tropical rainforests, but it's the temperate rainforests of the Pacific Northwest.
Oh, really? Why?
hmm So there's a couple reasons. One reason is the high level of moisture that they get accounts for an increase in vegetation. The lower temperatures in comparison to the rainforest means that there's less rapid decomposition of organic matter. But the salmon actually have a lot to do with it.
Ah,
Um, yeah, and so because of the salmon on that side of the world, salmon actually they do a couple different things. Salmon are a source of nitrogen for plants, and so these salmon that migrate back up into the forest, back up these streams, when they die and decompose, they actually provide a very important key nutrient for the plants in the forest. And you can actually trace this. You can, there's certain types of nitrogen where it's associated with marine sourced nitrogen. And you can like test these trees in the Pacific Northwest and you'll see like higher levels of like marine nitrogen than anywhere else in the world. So not only are these salmon fertilizing and providing nutrients for the plants in the forests, but I might be wrong on this, but I believe that like the Pacific Northwest actually has, in comparison to the rest of the world, like a really high amount of tertiary predators. Just because like the salmon can sustain them all. It provides so much food, not only for like the land and the plants, but also the animals around that it accounts for it's not all temperate forests. It's specifically the Pacific Northwest, but it has the highest amount of biomass per square meter than anywhere else in the world, including rainforests.
a question from the chat is what is the tertiary predator?
Oh, sorry. So a tertiary predator is a top predator. So it would be a better way to phrase this is an animal at the top of the food chain. So animals that would be consuming salmon that I would consider to be tertiary predators would be you have wolves, you have bears, you have eagles. But I guess like on a lower scale, these wouldn't be top of the food chain, but somewhere there, you have like coyotes, you have otters, and who else eats salmon? Everything eats salmon. Even the insects. Lots of insects feed off of salmon too, the dead and decomposing ones.
So every life stage of this salmon is feeding something.
Absolutely. Oh yeah.
And it's really cool how you mentioned it's also not all temperate forests. It's that one in particular in the Pacific Northwest due to all
Yep.
the
The
moisture
salmon
levels.
migrations
Yeah.
and the moisture levels and the temperature. Yeah.
So the fact that it rains all the time is a good thing for that environment.
For that environment, at least for the organic matter,
That is
for that
really
matter.
cool. Not at all what I would have expected. Again, like I mean, I was leaning on like Amazon, and I was just like, I don't know, ocean.
hmm
Let's do the Mariana Trench. That is a really cool takeaway to it, and the nitrogen fixing part too. Is like you don't generally, at
It's
least
huge.
I don't generally think of animals as being part of that recycling, right? But rather, like that's a plant thing. Like in school we were taught like peanuts were something that restored nitrogen levels, and that's what that
hmm
was got planted when you were cycling different crops, right? Never a fish. And so it's interesting too that that's that presumably the Canuck salmon, right?
All of the Pacific salmon.
All of the so it's
All of them.
all the Pacific Salmon being involved in
Yeah,
this.
because they all. I mean, I don't know all the fun places that they go, but it's primarily like mostly the Pacific Northwest where you'll find salmon that come and migrate and go into the river systems to spawn. And so they're going like not super deep into forests, but like decently. There are some that like I think the Fraser River is super long and really goes like deeper into Canada than you would like think. And like, you got salmon migrating like all the way up there too, which
That's I really like that. It's such a surprising fact.
yeah, I was shocked by it too cuz if you had asked me, I would have said rainforest too, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just a really unique set of circumstances and it just really goes back to like show the importance of salmon and in the ecosystem and to just like that area. It's I don't know, I love salmon so much.
For both eating and for sustainability, but not your
Yeah.
favorite fish to eat.
No, it's up there, but it's not my number one favorite.
So, I guess to kind of reset a little bit, what got you originally interested on the fish side of things? Like to look at fish sustainability and farming because it was right you were on a terrestrial farm with cows and
Mhm.
chickens. What was it that was pulling you towards the fish?
I guess at the same time, like, in taking my aquaculture course, like I just love salmon. I've always loved salmon. But in terms of like the broader spectrum, like the ocean and fish and fisheries, again, it was very similar to my animal ethics course where I had a change in perception. I went into that course not with a strong set of opinions, but I had thoughts. And, like a lot of people in chat, I didn't agree with fishing. I didn't agree with fishing wild fish. I'm like, that's bad. That's horrible. Why are we doing that? But after taking this course and learning about the different systems and things that we put in place to actually make fishing sustainable and fishing um, wild fish not a bad thing, actually, it really changed my perception of the whole thing. And I think like when I have moments like that, it almost encourages me to learn more about it so that I can like share this knowledge because I didn't know this. And I think that was one of the problems that we were talking about in that, conservation course. It's like, wow, this is really cool information. I've learned so much, but this is not easily accessible information. And, I actually made a point where I was like, I think, we need to reach out to other avenues like what you do here on Twitch and, talking to people online about these things that people wouldn't normally know about. You don't learn about this stuff through the news. You don't learn about this stuff in elementary school and high school. You learned this through very specific niche university courses, right? Like, where are people going to get that information? And so I think, yeah, definitely when you learn about things that change your perception, change your mindset, change how you view the world, really interest me. And that's why I kind of did a little bit of a dive towards that side of education with fish and ocean and conservation.
It's the importance of where you're getting the information, right, and who's delivering it.
Hmm.
Because, like you said, the news is gonna have an agenda. Other people are gonna
Yeah.
have an agenda too, but the way that you're presenting this is like, here are the facts, and you can make your own decision what you want to, but this is
Yeah.
just the information to go off. It's like you said, like that unbiased training can make a world of
Hmm.
a difference, and you being that unbiased deliverer of the information really makes it unique and accessible.
Hmm. No,
And like,
absolutely. And, I've said it multiple times just even today. It's like, these are my thoughts, these are my opinions. And I'm like, you're allowed to disagree. That's okay. Right?
and that's one of the reasons why y'all that Ultra I consider as one of our besties because she embodies a lot of the beliefs. Like we have a very, very similar belief system that we share. That's why I look up to her, not just as a content creator, but as an educator too, is because she it does like I am gonna like drop you the knowledge of how
Hmm.
what the facts are, but regardless of what the takeaway is, like you are feel free to like take away that information, do with it what you will. I'm just delivering it to you in an unbiased way, which I think is really remarkable and admirable of what you do and how you do it, Ultra.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, when you try to shove information down everyone's throats, no one likes that. Everybody likes to have agency about the information that they get and what they do with that information. And I believe us as scientists and people in STEM, like part of our job is doing what we can to share this information in an unbiased way and just having this information available. Like, here's this information. Do what you want with it. But it's out there and it's here and it's available for you.
It's well said in the chat too. Is that leading by curiosity,
Mhm.
which I really like that sentiment to it. A question on the fish is, what can we do as being good stewards to salmon to make sure they continue to breed and live? So I guess what are the some of the ethical best practices for sustainable farming with respect to fish?
Yeah, I would say right now, if you are consuming like wild salmon, looking at the labeling and the certification associated with the packaging, and even if maybe you go to the grocery store and there's no labels on it, you just, get it fresh from their, not butcher, but where they have the fish. Look at the grocery store. Usually, if you look up a grocery store chain and you look up, Safeway, sustainability fish. It'll give you information as to like what they stand behind, what's how if their fish are certified, what the certifications are, and I don't know, maybe some grocery chains like they don't have that information, but just you have to be your best advocate and you have to do that research. Having wild salmon is not inherently a bad thing, but making sure it's caught properly and it's caught at proper times of the year and it's done in a way that reduces bycatch, like, that's what we want. And then in terms of aquaculture, I don't really actually have a lot of information. The emergence of aquaculture is, in the grand scheme of, agriculture is relatively new. Before it was viewed as, like, aquaculture is great, we don't have to fish wild fish anymore, and then we, see these open sea nets, and it's like, "Oh, all the wild salmon are kinda dying when they migrate past it. Oh, that's not very good." And so I'm not really sure if there's any sort of information or certification that is available, where you can make those choices where maybe you're supporting a company that has better aquaculture practices. But yeah, my best advice to you is each location, each area of the world, they're going to have different certifications, different policies. You just have to be your best advocate and do the research.
I think that's really well said. We have some questions too about continuing your journey in the sciences. So we did take a wee rabbit hole for several hours to talk about conservation, sustainable
Yeah.
farming. But we are chatting like Women's History Month and the importance of
hmm
keeping women in STEM. Would you be able to give us a little bit of a glean into with your journey, what was it like being a woman in STEM throughout this journey in terms of accessibility? And what would you say to someone who's thinking about this journey and also like diving into STEM as a woman?
Yeah. I would say, thankfully, at least for me in my experience, especially being in Canada, it's very multicultural. I really didn't have any barriers to education or the type of education I got. I am very fortunate in the sense that I never felt like my gender influenced my schooling. If anything, in a lot of these science courses, I would I would say it was predominantly women in these courses too. I think the women outnumbered the men, which is not actually what I was expecting when I went into school. Like, I kind of had this perception of, oh, sciences, like, I don't know why I thought there would be more men but no, the women outnumbered the men, absolutely. Um, I would say that for other women out there in chat, especially if you are someone involved in STEM, don't underestimate your value or your importance. And because there are a lot of other women who they will look up to you and they see you as a role model. And I've actually had a lot of women express to me that, especially more in like engineering, which is something I didn't continue pursuing, but they felt more comfortable when they had more women in the class or there was a female professor or female TA. Like, they saw that and they noticed that and they felt less isolated and more comfortable in that environment. And so for us women out there, just we're existing, we're talking about what we're doing. Even that is you're doing so much for other women in just making them feel more comfortable and safe in this space. But yeah, no, I'm really fortunate that, with my experiences, it was very, very positive, but I know for other women out there that's not necessarily the story, especially when it comes to like even outside of school on a more professional level as well. There's just a lot of crap that women have to deal with in STEM.
As someone who's gone through the schooling, as someone
Mhm.
who's done the hard work, as someone who has the passion, as someone who's experienced the economic discrimination that you have, as someone who's now a
Mhm.
successful content creator, Twitch pushing for ambassador, I must say. Um, what does it mean to you to not only be a woman in STEM, but be to someone that other women in the sciences or getting into the sciences can look up to?
It means it means the world to me that I'm able to do what I do on Twitch and educate and advocate for science and um, be that role model, be that person. And I've got pretty thick skin, and so people can say things to me. It doesn't deter me, and I am that person who is unapologetically I'm staying here. Whether it has to do with my hobbies or being a person in STEM. Um, you can't scare me out of what I'm doing because I'm a woman, and I'm hoping that in being that role model, it normalizes women in these positions. Basically, it's I'm not an anomaly. There's a lot of us. There's a lot of us out there, and the sexism and the crappy comments aren't going to change that. I've noticed, especially not so much on the STEM side, but a lot of the simulation games that I play. It's not a lot of women play it, but through me streaming these games and putting myself out there, I've had a lot of women approach me being like, "Wow, it is so good to see another female playing this. Like, I thought I was alone. Like, it's so good to see you there." And I hope through in talking about science and being in these positions that through being transparent and unapologetically myself, representing women, that yeah, it just helps women be more comfortable. And it's really good to see that times are changing and things are changing and progress is being made and more progress needs to be made. But yeah, just the fact that there was genuinely through the sciences more women than men in my classes. It was like kind of it was great to see. It was fantastic.
I can't tell you how happy I am that you are unapologetically you. Uh, that's what y'all like immediately I think drew our friendship together is that you can very easily tell that Ultra is in fact genuine. This isn't for show. This is who she is. She is in fact
Hmm.
passionate about these things. And ma'am, I hope just more people look up to you and more people if they need anyone to emulate, it should be you because you are absolutely incredible. We had a couple of more questions if you still have some time for us.
Oh, I've got time. Yeah, you let me know when you want to kick me out.
The Ma'am, don't tempt me because we don't wanna ever get rid of you. We will future tease, y'all, there will be, hopefully, future crossovers with Ultrasaurus as well. We're never gonna run out of bioethics to talk about, so we'll have crossovers in
Hmm.
the future. But you actually mentioned some of the simulation games that you've been doing, like Farm
Hmm.
Simulator, I mean, even Project Zomboid, right, has some animal ethics in it. Could you tell us a little bit about if someone were to stream a game and to talk a
Hmm.
little bit about the science behind it in terms of what your expertise is in, which is the animal welfare and the ethics story,
Yeah.
what in your gaming history do you think is like a good supplement to the scientific topic and why that is?
Supplement. So are we assuming is this someone looking to further their education or someone looking to draw parallels with what they're playing?
Maybe
Sorry, just
drawing
to clarify.
maybe drawing the parallel. So if I'm watching you play a game and I can ask you as the
Hmm.
bioethicist about like real life things. What is maybe a good parallel to watch you play that it's like true to life things that's accounting for important issues when encountering like with farming and like accounting for the animal welfare.
Yeah, I mean, specifically with animal welfare, I would say like games like Planet Zoo. Um, they give you a lot of information about the animals and especially like conservation status and their needs. So that's something. I mean, you just did that earlier this week.
And we're
It's really
hooked
easy
on
to.
that now. We're hooked on it. It's incredible at the level of detail on that in that game of like the
Oh, it's
genetics
beautiful.
even, right? Of like this is
Absolutely.
a genetically quote valuable animal for biodiversity and this one isn't. And so like who you mate and how you do the mating scheme on those, like that's a really, really beautiful game to be able to have that.
I would say another one. I mean, we already just kind of talked about it, but Farm Sim is a great game too. You're raising pigs, you're raising cows and chickens, sheep, goats, horses. You don't eat the horses, but there's horses in the game. Um, but technically, you don't eat any of the animals in the game. It's rated E for everyone, so it's you harvest the eggs and the milk and the wool and whatnot. We don't eat the animals in Farm Sim. Um, but yeah, that's another one where talking about animal practices and what animals need, what they don't need, and especially talking about like maybe things that are missing in the game that you would want animals to have, like enrichment items, like head scratchers for the cows and the goats and everything. I like those are the two games that come to mind immediately, but gosh, like anything and will cause me to segue into I talking about sharks, talking about horses, talking about dinosaurs, talking about chemistry, which we actually did a little bit last night. And I realized the importance of actually, Blint, what you do here. Um, in the game that I was playing, we encountered a lot of aromatic rings and resonance structures, and they actually showed like the different chirality of the branches on these organic structures on this board. And I was excited because I saw it. I was like, "Ooh, look at this!" And I kind of tried explaining it a little bit, but I realized, people in chat commented, they're like, "You're just saying words right now," which is, I'm like, "That's fine." I'm like, you know what? My understanding of chemistry, I understand it and I think it's cool, but I don't have a good enough knowledge about this subject to explain it in a way that everybody in the room can understand. And we kind of had a really fun moment where we realized that's how you know that someone really knows what they're talking about when they're able to take a subject matter and explain it to anyone and anyone can understand. And so like I just in that moment had a not that I don't already appreciate and love what you do, but I really did reflect on what you do here on Twitch and like what you do for science communication and outreach. And I'm like, man, like, Flint, you do such an amazing job. And I was just like, I didn't even try describing what chirality was to chat. I'm like, we're moving on. I can't do this right now. Triangles.
Yeah. Triangles, yeah. It's one of those like, everyone's an expert at something. And your explanation of like the bioethics side of things and like why this is important and to go into like what the
Mm-hmm.
considerations are, that you make beautifully accessible. And it's like I can talk about DNA, but as soon as we get to anything physicsy, oh, I'm so far out. And it's not that I don't think it's cool. I'm like, I couldn't explain that to myself,
Mm-hmm.
much less to someone else. But you're right. It's like one of those skills of when you're able to explain these things. And I feel again, that's the beauty of I love watching you play Farm Sim because I'll poke in some questions about like, well, is this cow happy? And how could you naturally tell? I really like that's where you
Mm-hmm.
dropped in of putting in like the scratchers and like these enrichment items for the
Yeah.
animals. So it shows like an avenue where even if the game is not perfect, you
Mm-hmm.
still get like a visual and a means by which to talk about what does work, what doesn't work.
Yep.
Is is there
Absolutely.
is there an aquatic farm simulator equivalent? Like, are there fish in said game?
The only game oh god, I mean, have you ever played Feed and Grow Fish?
No.
Oh, it's fun. Um, Basically, you start as like a little, I don't know what, pooter fish, some sort of species, and you eat other fish, and you grow bigger and bigger and bigger. And you can eat the whole pond if you can, but there's like a different variety of fish, and different ponds or environments have like different fish. So there's like a rivers and ponds. There's like an ocean, which have different species, like barracudas and salmon, and I can't even list all of the fish in this game, but that would be like a good. place to kind of talk about salmon and fish and
Mhm.
different species interactions and food chains and trophic levels. And besides that, no, I can't think of. There's actually a fishing game with like not like cast and reel. It's actually like you go out on these ships. It's like North Atlantic fishing or something, and you actually like have to catch lobsters and this and that, and you have to measure the lobsters, and if they're too small, you have to throw them back into the ocean. So that I mean, if you wanted to talk about fisheries and practices, that would be a good game for that, I guess.
Nice. Yes, Ultra, were there any other points that you really wanted to get at in terms of our fish discussion tonight?
I think one other thing that I wanted to, I guess, touch on was just specifically with bycatch and the importance of reducing it. Like when we think of bycatch, we think of things like we don't want dolphins getting caught, we don't want turtles getting caught, we don't get whales getting caught, and that's true. And seabirds, we don't want them getting caught. But we don't often consider um, what happens when other fish get caught. And so I think when fishing for halibut, and I might be wrong, but I think often rockfish are a bycatch product, which are
Rockfish.
really, really yes,
Okay.
right? I
No, no, no.
think.
I just making sure that I heard correctly.
And I know you've talked about rockfish on your stream. Essentially, rockfish when they are pulled up, especially from like big depths, they can't deal with the pressure change, and so even if you put them back into the water, they're dead. And the importance of that is, do you know how long it takes for rockfish to become reproductively viable?
Like a decade?
Might be something like that. It's a very long amount of time
Yeah.
until they can reproduce, and so it's pretty detrimental and brutal when you catch those guys as bycatch. Um, but one of the things that fishery companies do is they'll have a recording of the fish that are caught, and then they review the recording, and that person has to like report um like how much bycatch they saw and what species. And it's not perfect because obviously the fishing companies, I mean, it depends on how ethical they are, but if the less bycatch they have, the better. So if you were reporting less, it's probably more favorable for that person and their job security to maybe not see as much bycatch on the fishing ship. It's all and it depends on the ability of the person to identify and see and go through the footage properly. But they've actually come out with the use of AI to use these video feeds to automatically identify bycatch species of fish that were not the intended target, and like automate the whole system. And so it's like, I mean, AI isn't perfect and it's constantly getting trained, but it's a um unbiased way of recording bycatch in a way that you don't have to worry about biases or human error, which is really interesting and cool.
Is it and it's one of those things too of like how well the model is trained. So presumably it's like it's video that it's coming in. So like you get to
Yeah.
see what's being brought up. It seems like that's better than some guy just like looking at a video and like looking at ever so gently counting or even miscounting, right? As you said, it
Hmm.
would be benefit to them. And the AI component, I guess, as long as the model that you trained it on is good enough so that you have like data going in and like quality data coming out, it would be a worthwhile and pretty
Hmm.
standardized system to be able to have. What does one do with the bycatch data?
Um, I think it gets reported. I don't know if it in Canada if it goes. I would assume it would go to DFO, and it just goes into knowing the bycatch rates of certain fishing methods or what species are being caught. I guess in terms of conservation, that information is used. I just don't, off the top of my head, I can't describe to you like the entire process of like where that all goes. But um, these fisheries, they are required to report bycatch so that we know, like, hey, you caught salmon, but you also caught like 5 dolphins. Like that wasn't great, right?
So if I were to be a seeker of knowledge, where do I even find this kind of information? Like it's submitted to like this reporting
Ooh.
group. Is that something that I can readily look up, or it's Like the rockfish example, for
Oh.
example, if I pulled up a ton of rockfish,
Mhm.
and they're all going to be dead now, right? Because of the pressure change. And I've done
Yeah.
this huge like wipeout in that area. Well, that doesn't look good on me. But how does a non-expert get that information?
I actually, sorry again, off the top of my head, I don't know, but I would assume, I would think that actually the FAO might have information on that. They do a lot of information and statistics on fisheries around the world globally, and I would be surprised if they also didn't have information about bycatch as well. But like, I'm so sorry. Off the top of my head, I
No, no,
could not
no.
give you a single source right
No, no,
now.
no. There is no sorry on this. That's the sign I think of being a good scientist is just being like, I don't know. We're not just gonna like spew nonsense, right? Like that's this isn't some other channel on Twitch here, y'all. This is Science Streams with Ultrasaurus, who also doesn't sprout any nonsense.
Yeah.
Could you give us the acronym of what FAO stands for?
It is the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, and so they actually have like a lot of really cool information on a lot of different parts of like agriculture and food around the world. So if you wanted to look up how many farms have goats for like food purposes in Canada, they will tell you.
That's so
No,
cool.
it's wild. Like the amount of like you just have to be looking in the right places and using the right filters, but there's so much information that you can learn about food and farming and just like numbers from the FAO.
That is really, really cool. So presumably that's where the reporting would be too of the bycatch. Is
I
there
would assume, yeah.
is there anything that's done with that data in terms of the individuals who are responsible for it? So like the fisheries that end up
Oh.
like what is the ramification of it? Like is it just a black mark on an online record? Or is there some kind of ramification where the individuals now have to actually go in and change something about the fishing practice? And I don't know if you know this, Ultra, but like, can they still fish at the same site if there's a certain density of bycatch, or is it just changing the method by which you're doing the fishing?
Again, this is just guesswork because I don't know the details, but I would assume there's probably a threshold where there's a certain level of bycatch that is acceptable, and beyond that, just for conservation reasons, you would have to either A, not fish there or fish that, or choose a different method of fishing that would be more selective in what you're catching and very purposeful. It's really hard. And so in my course, we actually had a lot of really cool discussions with fishermen through Zoom, and they shared their thoughts and opinions. And like these fishermen were like very, very passionate about sustainability and conservation, and they're very aware that the ocean is not an infinite source of fish. It is limited, and we need to do our best to conserve them and do a good job of fishing in the sense that they can continue their profession and their job and not deplete the ocean. And both of these fishermen actually expressed a lot of frustration with DFO, the governing body that regulates fishing and fisheries in Canada, because they're out fishing on the ocean, and DFO is telling them what they can or can't do, but they're telling them from, I don't know, Ottawa in Ontario, which is in the middle of the province, nowhere near the oceans where these fisheries are. And if a place is, if there's a lower population of fish in a certain area, they'll go, okay, no, you can't fish there anymore. But then they don't tell them to stop fishing, and then they don't tell them or recommend where they should be fishing, because theoretically, if all the fishermen stop fishing there and they all go to the same
It'll be the
other
same
location,
issue.
isn't that exasperating the issue?
Yep.
And yeah, so a lot of them actually expressed like, we want more direction, we want more information, we want more transparency. And um they were like, it would be nice to have DFO there, like on the ocean with them, like seeing the problems, talking to these people in person and not just through like offices in a big city, right? And so actually, yeah, one of those fishermen were the ones that was talking about the issue with rockfish as a bycatch. And I can't remember what type of information and data he was collecting, but DFO just wasn't interested in it. Besides the fact that it was bycatch, but he's like, no, like I want to solve this problem. He's like, these are important fish, and I don't want to be like taking them out as bycatch. And just like DFO was just not really interested in looking into it further, which is
Yeah.
really sad to hear.
Yeah, you would hope and assume that that would be some, like, directive that they would be able to give information on of how
Mm-hmm.
to not take more
Yeah.
the bycatch and to avoid that uptake. That's
Mm-hmm.
kind of a
It's
disappointing
weird.
takeaway to it.
Yeah, and I don't think the organization is all bad, but
Mhm.
the experiences that these fishermen had, there was just a lot of frustration that you could hear coming from them. Absolutely.
It almost goes back to the original argument that you were telling us about, like, buy-in, right? About, like,
Mhm.
the seahorse overfishing. The way you're gonna get past that isn't just to tell people, like, don't do this, but getting that appropriate amount of buy-in, and that's a
Yep.
critical component of a lot of these different avenues, right, I feel, for us to
Yep.
be able to hit
Yep.
that sustainable fishing and the sustainable farming as well.
Mhm. And a
Yeah.
lot of these fishermen, they're out there, they're on their boats and they're catching local fish in a sustainable way and they're selling it to local people. Like they're adding to the economy. These are not fish that are being shipped from some other country or ocean or location. And so, in a way, again, it all has to do with doing your research, but there's a lot of local, if you are near an ocean, a lot of local fishermen that they're very dedicated to sustainability and conservation. And in purchasing fish from them, it helps encourage that form of fishing and that mindset. And it helps enable them to better, like, expand their business. So it's more common practice, like what they're doing. Um, so again, I personally, I don't like Seaspiracy on Netflix. I'm not a fan of their message was stop eating fish, just stop. Which, again, I don't think that's the answer, and you can agree or disagree with me, but I really do think, again, a lot of my opinions come back to consumerism. Put your dollar to good use. Support people who are actually ethically and sustainably doing things, because that encourages that to be the norm.
And that would be one way a regular person can help that is to buy from one of these locations that are these sourced in a particular way. Like you said, you further than that business, and that's what gets grows ahead, and that's what becomes the normal and standardized way, and that'll
Yeah.
help again benefit the environment. And can we just do a recap of why that's important? Like we've talked a lot today at Ultra about the bioethics of animal welfare,
Hmm.
about sustainable farming with respect to fish. At the end of the day, why does this matter?
There's only so many fish. We can't fish them all, and fish. I mean, salmon are. We discussed that they are a keystone species. They're not only important for other fish in the ocean, but for our terrestrial lands. Like they are a big reason why that very specific area of temperate rainforest has some of the highest biomass in all of the world. Um, our oceans, they are, I don't want to say they're fragile, but we can't continue this level of consuming resources in the ocean as we have. We need to be more conscious. We need to preserve these species, these ecosystems, these um, niches, and like once they're gone, that's it. We don't have them anymore. And can you, I couldn't imagine a world without fish. I couldn't imagine a world where it's like we literally can't fish anymore because there's nothing left. We've ruined it for everyone. It's not only important like culturally and also like food for us, but just for our environments and our ecosystems, and for even just to a degree like carbon sequestration. Did you? I actually learned to see it. Did you know that whales are huge carbon sinks? I didn't know that.
It's isn't it
What?
part of like the when it falls, the whale's body falls to the bottom of the ocean, like that's also helping the sequestration and like stuff eats it. So if they get
Yeah,
washed up on shore,
yeah,
like that's really bad for the environment.
yeah. No, it's super interesting stuff. If you told me that a few years ago, I would have been like, what? What do you mean? But yeah, no, it's important. I mean, it goes for anything on Earth, our life, our species, our environment, our biomes. We want to preserve them as much as we possibly can. And if we treat it like a infinite resource, it's going to disappear really quickly. If we want future generations to enjoy what we're experiencing now, the foods that we have available, we need to be more conscious of the choices that we make. And again, it's unfortunate. I had someone saying to me the other day, and I can't remember, we were talking about land animal agriculture or fish, but they were like, I shouldn't have to do research. Like, I shouldn't have to, like, why aren't the products, more clear? And it's like, well, it's just, that's how things work. Like, there's greenwashing, there's things that try to make you purchase it because it looks more appealing and more sustainable. Unfortunately, the research part, it falls back on the consumers, and it's hard because you have to be motivated to want to do good for the environment and do good for these fish. And so that's kind of the biggest takeaway message is you know every little bit counts, and just because you're one person, like, the choices you make do make a difference.
I can't think of a better note to end on. That was so beautifully said, Ultra. I was like, we can't top that one. We can't top that. Ultra, thank you so very much for joining us tonight. That was incredible, as it always is. That was a lot of fun chatting about, again, your journey in the sciences, about the
Hmm.
message for women in STEM and maintaining women in STEM, and then also just the importance of farming and sustainable farming with respect to fish, which is just, I don't know. You would have told me a few years ago, be like, it's just fish. But I'm like, oh, that is really, really cool of a topic. And
Fish
there's,
are so cool.
yeah. But like fish farming, like who knew? Like we could be
Hmm.
on the Twitch front page talking about the aquaculture and how that goes in and like all the sustainability. I think it's an
Hmm.
amazing topic. And part of my curiosity is, again, prompted by you and how you dispel like the incorrect information versus providing us with the information of what exactly is happening. I just thank you for everything that you do for so many people. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, you do
Thank you
inspire.
for having me. This is stuff that I I feel like it's very apparent. I love talking about this stuff. I love learning, but I also love teaching, and I just, things that I grasp onto where I'm like, that's super cool. I'm also like, let me tell you this really cool thing, right? Like, I just love sharing. And again, like, just circling back, like, I respect what you do here for Twitch, for everything you do with science outreach and education, because like, this is how we get information out. This is how we educate, and this is how we change the world. Like, honestly. So thank you so much for having me, and I was so tickled pink that you wanted me amongst the many other amazing, fantastic female content creators also in STEM to be here to talk about what we do for the month of March. So thank you for highlighting women and for just being a fantastic advocate.
But
Oh.
seriously, Ultra, thank you so much for your time, your expertise, your presence on Twitch, and your friendship. That was our conversation with Ultrasaurus. You can find links to all her social media in the show notes. Thank you for listening.